Hello, my name is Father Lawrence Jagdfeld. I am a Franciscan friar, and I am the administrator of CUSA, an apostolate of persons with chronic illness and or disability. Once again, we will hear another story from the Gospel with which I am sure you are very familiar. Jesus said to the Pharisees, "There was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen and dined sumptuously each day. And lying at his door was a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Dogs even used to come and lick his sores. When the poor man died, he was carried away by angels to the bosom of Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. And from the netherworld, where he was in torment, he raised his eyes and saw Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side. And he cried out, 'Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am suffering torment in these flames.' Abraham replied, 'My child, remember that you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus likewise received what was bad. But now he is comforted here, whereas you are tormented. Moreover, between us and you a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go from our side to yours, or from your side to ours.' He said, 'Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they too come to this place of torment.' But Abraham replied, 'They have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them.' He said, 'Oh, no, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent.' Then Abraham said, 'If you will not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone should rise from the dead.'" This story is peculiar or particular to St. Luke. It doesn't appear in the other Gospels. However, it is not particular in the literature of the time. There are many such stories in ancient literature. In Egyptian writings, we hear about a reincarnated son who takes his father on a tour of the realm of the dead, where he sees a rich man who was buried in fine linen and a poor man who was buried on a straw mat. Their places were reversed in the world of the dead. In Greco-Roman literature, there is a story of Lucian of Samosata, who wrote about Gallus and Catalpus, in which a poor shoemaker is contrasted with a rich patrician. Even in Jewish literature, there's a story of the reversal of a poor Torah teacher and a rich toll collector. There is one difference in Luke's story, however, where the theme of resurrection is added. We cannot tell whether this is a post-resurrection addition to the story or whether Jesus is taking advantage of the fact that the Pharisees, to whom this story is addressed, believe in the resurrection of the dead. They were the audience for the parable, so this may be, in fact, the way Jesus ended the parable. The story is not about our concept of heaven and hell. Jewish people don't think that way. The dead went to Sheol. They went to the netherworld, to the underworld. Both the good and the bad went to Sheol. The good lived there in relative ease, whereas those who were bad lived in torment. You notice that the characters in the parable are all dead people, even Abraham. This man, this poor Lazarus, is resting in the bosom of Abraham, not in the bosom of God. So this story is about what happens in Jewish thought. And the rich man who had everything in life is now in torment, whereas the poor man who had nothing in life is now living in comfort. Now this flies directly in the face of Jewish thought. For the Jewish people believed that if you were good, if you did the Lord's bidding, if you were faithful to the covenant, you would receive good things. And so the rich man in this tale would have been considered a good man. He was, after all, a rich man. And Lazarus, on the other hand, would have been considered a sinner because he was not able to enjoy those things in life. He was a poor man. He was a sickly man. Even the dogs came to lick his sore. So he would have been regarded as being the sinner. So what this story is really doing is illustrating a point that Luke has been making throughout the gospel, and which we have heard over and over and over again. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. But once again, it is addressed to the Pharisees. It is addressed to the very people who would have held on to that thought that if they obeyed the law, they would be rewarded with good things. The very people who believed like the rich man, who is not named in the parable, but the very people who thought just like that rich man are the ones who end up on the short end here. We also have to recognize that the rich man didn't do anything bad. There's no mention in the entire parable of him committing any sin. His sin was basically one of not seeing the poor man who lived right there on his doorstep. He ignored him. He simply didn't see him. And his punishment is now that he has to look at that man in the bosom of Abraham. He didn't see him before, so for the rest of eternity, he will spend time seeing the poor man in the bosom of Abraham. The man even shows that he is not terribly, awfully evil. He's concerned about his brothers. But once again, Abraham turns the tables here. He says, you had Moses, you had the prophets. You didn't need anybody to come and tell you that this was going to be your end. And indeed, one of the principles of the covenant of Sinai, the principle that was most often forgotten, was the fact that the Jewish people were enjoined by God to care for those less fortunate. If you read through all of the prophets, the 5 major prophets, the 12 minor prophets, they all say the same thing. There are really only 2 sins which they speak of: the sin of idolatry and the sin of failing to care for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, for the alien in their midst. These were all people that the covenant specifically cited as being the ones that the Jewish people were to care for. And so Lazarus represents them in this parable, and the rich man is condemned simply because he fails to see him. Once again, we have to ask ourselves how this informs our lives. And I can't help but mention again that our new Holy Father, Pope Francis, has made his concern for the poor, his preaching about the poor, a hallmark of his pontificate thus far. He has been insistent on the fact that we who have a great deal must be concerned about those who have little. He has told us that our headlines should scream not when the stock market fails, but when a poor person dies of hunger. He has told us that we shouldn't be worried about the closing of banks any more than we should be concerned about the fact that we have to close institutions that care for the poor. These are the things that the gospel speaks to. Are we seeing the poor in our midst? Are we paying attention to the poor in our midst? For more information about CUSA, please visit us at www.cusan.org or visit us on Facebook.